44 years is a very, very long time in politics. It takes us, for example, from the elections of the 1920s, in which the Democratic Party was the party of segregationists. They nominated, in 1924, the Democrats nominated the man for president who would become the attorney who advocated for segregation in the Brown v. Board of Education case. And they went from that to the 1964 Civil Rights Act. It's a long time. And that implies that you all have probably a long time ahead of each of you. And I want to talk to you, this is the big thought, about how you are going to be needed. After this election, we are going to have a big project of reconstitution to do in American politics. If Vice President Harris wins, that is going to be a shock to the Republican Party. It may drive it temporarily even farther out to the intolerable extreme, intolerable and intolerant extreme. But it also will highlight the need that America needs a responsible party of enterprise and commerce and property and entrepreneurship, and the need for those of you who are inclined that way to be active in rebuilding it. You will have the time to do the work. Think Democrats 1920 to 1964, how big that change was. That's how big a change could be ahead of you. If Donald Trump wins, you all have another job of the Constitution ahead of you, and that is protecting this democracy against someone who intends to destroy it for the sake of plutocracy at home and autocracy abroad. Don't go down without a fight. It will be there will be a lot of people telling you, should Trump win, the game's over. It's never over. It's never over. Or as John Belushi said in Animal House, it's not over until we say it's over. It's going to be nasty in that case, but you'll have time and life to fight for the things that are important. I think the people around Donald Trump imagine politics as a game with some Harry Potter cheat code, that if he wins or converts a minority of the voter into a majority of the Electoral College, that he is then entitled to shut down the legal system of the United States, to break the law with impunity, to pardon his criminal associates, to make whatever dirty deals abroad he wants to do. There are no cheat codes unless you agree. It's not over until you say it's over. So you have two tasks ahead of you, depending on the outcome. I look forward to being an observer of either. I very much hope that if this election goes the right way, that I can step back, because one of the great dangers in journalism is staying too long. The country we are born into is not the country we grow old in. And there's a real risk that you can carry around the memory of the country that was into the country that is and will be. That'll be your job, your work, and I'm delighted to talk to you and to hear from your perspective what that work looks like to you. And I'll take whatever questions you want.
Perfect. So let's obviously start with option B, given that the fight is probably the one that we're all thinking about. And so when you say fight and you're looking out at an audience of young folks who often have a hard time of operationalizing their involvement, right? Where they know that they should be involved, they follow politics closely, but what are the actual tangible steps you're thinking of when you say fight? Where should they be involved and how should they be involved?
Well, we need to think a little bit about how modern authoritarianism works. I spent a month in Hungary in 2016 for a story that actually ended up never being written. Well, it was written, and presented. So when I presented the Atlantic my 10,000 words on the future of Hungarian politics, they were not as enthusiastic about that as I thought they should be. So I ended up cannibalizing a lot of that work for later work when Donald Trump won. But one of the things I was struck by in Hungary is, Viktor Orban never stopped electing. There were always elections. And they weren't fair, but they were kind of free. That is, if you cast your vote in Hungary, it was counted. And you wouldn't be arrested. Viktor Orban never killed anybody, of course. I mean, Hungary is a member state of the European Union, a signatory to the European Convention on Human Rights. He didn't improperly jail anybody. One of the most perceptive things that anybody said to me on that trip, and I am building to the answer to your question, was in a modern bureaucratic state, the greatest power of the authoritarian ruler is not the power to persecute the innocent, but the power to protect the guilty. One of Viktor Orban's methods is he'd walk along the street and there'd be 4 restaurants, all of which had health code violations. One would be owned by an associate of his or a supporter, no problem. 3 would be not, problems. Now, they had genuinely broken the health code. I mean, they had deserved it, but all had broken the health code. And everyone understood if you broke the health code and you were an ally, no problem. If you broke the health code and you weren't an ally, problem. But the election here in the United States, the elections will not stop. They will become decreasingly fair, but they will be free. There will be a lot of attempt to dissuade people from voting, deter people from voting. There will be a lot of gerrymandering and manipulation, but the power of the vote will remain. You will not be sent to prison for what you say. You will be harassed, perhaps, mobbed on social media. If Donald Trump wins, Elon Musk's investment in Twitter will have paid off, and he will use that, and other people will use other kinds of platforms to try to mob you and harass you and drive you from participation in the dialogue. But you will be free, and so you need to use the freedoms you have in defense of the freedoms that are most at risk. One of the things I think that will happen very early if Donald Trump wins, is an attempt to shut down all the legal cases against him. The federal criminal cases, bring pressure on the states to stop the state criminal cases, bring other kinds of pressure to stop the civil cases. We don't know what the answer to the question of what are the rules governing the criminal liability of a president, because it just hasn't come up. But we have some precedents to guide us. When Aaron Burr shot and killed Alexander Hamilton, he was vice president of the United States, and he was indicted in both New York and New Jersey. And the New Jersey case was dropped because the state of New Jersey in those days regarded dueling as kind of a victimless crime, like marijuana smoking. And they just didn't think we should be interfering in people's private affairs like that. But it was technically illegal, and he was indicted. Spiro Agnew, when he was serving vice president, was indicted. So the principle is clear that the vice president of the United States can be held to account under both state criminal law, as Aaron Burr was, and federal criminal law, as Spiro Agnew was. And if the vice president can, since the vice president could be president at any second, there is no reason to believe the president can't. The Supreme Court decision on this is garbage. It's horrible. What the Supreme Court did, it's like Roe v. Wade in reverse. They just said, without any textual basis, without any legal basis, what do we think the scheme should be? And let's impose it on the country with no legitimacy to our authority. Let's just pull this notion out of our noggin. So what should you do? You should be ready to watch things. You should participate. You should be ready to participate in the congressional elections. And you should, one last thing, you should remember that the law is a resource. That there are all kinds of, you have seen this in recent protest developments, there are all kinds of people who want to say, I'm putting myself outside the law for some great cause. And often those people are just antisocial people who like breaking windows, and they'd be hooligans otherwise. But the law is a resource. Never, ever, ever let anyone else claim the law against you. The law is yours. Always obey it, and always figure out how do we use it.
So you mentioned voting in congressional elections. You say use the law. I'm going to hammer you again and to ask more tangibly. In between elections, especially given that where we live now, we know what the vote is going to be for a presidential election. We don't necessarily have representation within Congress in D.C. What are the in-between steps that students who care, who understand that institutions matter, what should they be involved in? How should they participate in a democracy that doesn't exist on accident?
One important, make sure you're registered to vote in the District of Columbia, and if you are, and you get a jury summons, obey it. And especially if you get a grand jury summons, obey it. The DC doesn't have voting rights, but the DC grand juries more than make up for the lack of vote in the power they potentially have, because the criminal associates of a restored President Trump will sooner or later be appearing before the DC grand jury. So if you have the opportunity to be on it, do not refuse. It's inconvenient, it's time consuming, it's worth it. I've served on a DC jury, I think now probably 5 times, and I have moaned about it every single time, and I've always been so grateful for the experience afterwards. You see, that is, Tocqueville was right, that is the school of democracy, where people of extraordinarily different backgrounds come together on a fundamental human decision and discover they can work together, and discover that they can, instead of, juries don't, you vote at intervals, but you mostly just talk until you reach a consensus. And so there's the wife, actually, the one I was on the grand jury with the wife of a very powerful and important person, and there was a bus driver. There are teachers, there are small landlords, there are professionals, there are students, too few, and they find some way to work together. Do those things, and pay attention, and be and vote in congressional elections, and when if there is a need for protest on the streets, be there and do your part to make sure that protest is lawful and orderly.
So we didn't get long before we got to Trump, as any political conversation goes. He's the number one. I say Republican, you think Trump. But the reality is despite how powerful the president can be unilaterally within our system, he does need a lot of actors to go along with what he wants. And so how fearful, especially given your range within the Republican Party from the days of Reagan to now, where do you stand on the current state of the Republican Party? How much blame do you put at the feet who know better?
Yeah.
And what can we do to... Donald Trump at some point will be gone from the stage.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that Trumpism will be.
Well, let's start by giving some credit where credit is due. So people can be very, very conservative and yet still committed to the rule of law, as Mike Pence proved in those last minutes that vindicated the whole of whatever else he did throughout his career. Those last minutes of his career, he earned a place in the history of this country. He was under pressure. I was very struck at the rally in New York where Donald Trump talked about his secret deal with Mike Johnson. You all got, I'm sure everyone here who studies Congress knows what he was thinking about. Why did Trump say that publicly? If Johnson were on board with that plan, Trump wouldn't have said anything. He was trying to mobilize that mob to bring pressure to bear on Speaker Johnson. And why is he doing that? Because he's obviously private, to my mind, I should say opposite, to my mind, he has raised the issue with Johnson, and Johnson was evasive. And so he was doing to him what he often did to Pence, which is to say in front of 20,000 people, right, Mike? So one of the things that's going to be important is does Johnson have in him some of the stuff of Mike Pence? I'm optimistic that he does, or does he not? Republicans have tended to overestimate themselves. I mean, Mitch McConnell thought he would outwit Donald Trump and defeat him, and he got his way on many issues, but in the end Trump defeated him. But if you are, the Republican Party is going to need to regenerate. It's going to need to regenerate from the states. And if you are leaving DC at the end of your studies to return to where you're from, you might want to think about being active in the local level and recalling the Republican Party that used to have a positive purpose in the nation's life.
How do you have those conversations? Especially, I can imagine, given where we are and what we study, we probably lean left, a lot of us here. And so having those conversations, especially if you are of a generation of not that age, right, where you don't personally remember, how do you have those conversations at an individual level where you don't put them in a defensive, where they're deciding between party loyalty and institutional loyalty?
Well, first, if you're going back to North Carolina or Indiana or Georgia, someplace like that, and you want to get involved in local politics, you won't always be young, you know. It seems incredible, but it's true. And you may discover yourself owning a little business someday. And you may discover just encountering some pettifogging, irritating, pointless regulation and thinking, this is bullshit. Now I understand what my grandfather was talking about. And you will be, there's a reason why, like, both the parties were put on this earth for reasons. Because, like, from the highest philosophical, both of them are saying things that are true. And both liberty and equality are true. Both the rights of workers and the need of enterprise are true. And you may have a role on the other side of this. And then when you are running whatever small business you're running and dealing with the dumb local regulation that says you can't use the freight elevator on Saturdays because of some law passed in 1927 that no one has gotten around to abolishing, you'll discover that as you work with people, that people are more, one of the things I try to push back on all the time is this idea that everyone in the 46 or 47% who vote for Trump is part of the Trump base. And they're not. Some are, but most are just voting their party, most are voting antagonistically. I was at a conference the day after Yahya Sinwar, the leader of Hamas, was shot dead. And one of the conference attendees who owned a successful business came into the green room and said, by the way, we're talking about this. He said, do you follow foreign affairs? I said, well, I try. He said, there's some commotion in the Middle East. Somebody was shot. I don't know who. I don't know why. You're meeting a payroll? But you know what? The country's full of people like that who don't know who was shot and why, and they vaguely heard something about it while flipping through the news to hear how the local high school football team had done. So those are the people you're going to be working with. Don't despair of your fellow citizens. Don't be driven into alienation from them. I think there's a lot of advice about you need to think always like a pessimist, but you need to act like an optimist. You need to be ready for the worst, but always prepared for the best. And you need to be open to the possibility that people will surprise you, and they can always be summoned to their best nature. I really do believe that.
So one of the things that bugs me most is that you're often around policymakers, you're often around decision makers who will tell you one thing in private and then act differently in public.
Yeah.
And so how do you come down? I'm imagining you have a ton of these conversations where, again, you're surrounded by people who know better. They'll tell you they know better, and then they get in front of a stage where their name is attached to a ballot or their name is attached to a vote, and they go completely different. Using it as a vehicle for political expediency or lasting power in this business, how do you square those contradictions?
Well, two truths. First, if you're in public life, the only thing that matters is what you do publicly. That is who you are, not the private person, but the public person. You are, as a public person, you're a public record. At the same time, it's also true there are a lot of people in private life who are deflecting the worst. And the story I love most in this regard is Donald Trump's story, the story of Donald Trump in the military parade. Mm-hmm. So Donald Trump, when he was newly elected president, went to France for the Bastille Day ceremonies in July of 2017. And the French have a big military parade for reasons rooted in French history. And Trump saw this and he just loved it. He loved it. He said, I want one of those. And he came back home and he told the military, I want one. And now the military will never disobey a presidential order, of course. But they will sometimes point out some difficulties with the presidential order, especially when they don't want to do things. And they badly wanted not to do this for a series of reasons. So above all, it looked political. That they're never, unlike the French who've been doing this since I don't know when, the American military has never done this. If they did this at Trump's command, it would look like they were taking sides on the Trump presidency, and they wanted not to do that. Second, the United States military is full of highly trained professionals who have modern wars to fight that do not involve bayonets and marching. That the people who do the hacking of the Russian drones probably are not great at marching. And it's probably a waste of their time and taxpayer money to teach them how to march. And they don't have bayonets, and they don't know what to do. They can't even open a can of soup with them, much less the way soldiers used to do, much less. So they didn't want to be like, these guys. And finally, soldiers don't get enough time off, and if we do have a free weekend, they should be with their families instead of marching down Pennsylvania Avenue. But they don't disobey a presidential order, and so they kept finding reasons why it couldn't be done. They said, yeah, well, Mr. President, if we take a tank down Pennsylvania Avenue, tanks weigh 80 tons, it'll crush the asphalt, we'll repave it, and we don't have budget to repave the asphalt of the District of Columbia. And Trump would say, don't be ridiculous, I have a report right here that says it'll only cost X. And the Pentagon said, well, we have a report that says it'll cost 10X. Trump said, I believe my report. Wait a minute, your report is on the front page of the Washington Post. How'd that happen? And it was literally, the Washington Post had a story that Trump was using wrong figures for how much it would cost to repave Pennsylvania Avenue after a military parade. And they never said no, they just kept deflecting it. And in the way they kept deflecting when he tried to leave NATO. The president of the military, of course, can never disobey an order, but it can also make you more aware. And those people who do those things are doing important work. So the private and the public, you are the public, but the actions you do in private also matter. So let's transition into the media, right? And that is a huge term that catches way too many people. It is increasingly fractured. Anyone with a video, anyone with a blog can claim media status. I'm curious as to, given your long history in the space, what are your views on the current state of the media? It's often used as a convenient scapegoat of promoting certain policies, of false equivalencies. Where do you stand on the state of the media and the near and long-term future of it? Well, thank you for the way you framed the question, because especially among people my age, they often use the media to mean companies that were important in 1972. So By far, the most important media company in the country is Google. And Facebook is important, and Reddit is important. And yeah, the CBS Evening News is not unimportant, but I think there's a lot of bad faith argument that comes from Trump world that tries to insist the media is the CBS Evening News and the New York Times, and not the vast complex of much more powerful entities that also do media work. And as you said, and this is so true, in the modern world, we're all the media. Anyone, the viral, when you create a TikTok thing that goes viral, that's the media. So we live in a media democracy in which we're all participants, and we all have potential power, and we have to use that power responsibly. And we have to not think that the media means them, and partly that is a tic and a habit, but partly it's bad faith. It's a way, I mean, when people are on the most important cable channel in the United States, which is acting as a kind of super PAC of one party, and then say the media do this and the media do that, like, who are you? Or when right-wing commentators will say something, I know no one in the media who supports Donald Trump. They mean the CBS Evening News, and probably there is someone at the CBS Evening News who does, but that doesn't matter because the real point is, well, there are a lot of people at X and Facebook and Google who do, and they're the media too. That's how people get their information.
So you subscribe to the definition of media is where information is provided.
Media literally means conduit, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the media, there are media, and then there are mass media, which is where this term originally began, are all means by which information and maybe even pseudo-information is conveyed from one source to a large market. And we're all in it. So when you say, what is the state of the media? One of the things we all need to remember, during 2016, when there was a lot of creation of false information, and much of it pro-Trump, but not all, there was a lot of consternation of disinformation and misinformation and who was providing it and why. And I always thought the part of the story we didn't pay enough attention to was who was demanding it and why. The most circulated false story of the 2016 campaign was a story that was fake to look like it came from local news, which is a source very trusted by older people. It suggested that Pope Francis had endorsed Donald Trump. Now, I'm not a Catholic, but if I were Catholic enough to care whether the Pope had endorsed Donald Trump, I would be Catholic enough to know that popes don't endorse candidates for office in the United States. They didn't endorse John F. Kennedy. They didn't endorse Al Smith. They certainly aren't going to endorse Donald Trump, who insulted the Pope only a few months before. The people who cared most about that story had at some level to know that it's not true. They accepted the story because they wanted to believe it was true. And the moral of the story is not to scold them, although we should do that too, but also to be careful with ourselves, because are we guilty ever of believing false news because we want to believe it? I mean, I have a hard saying for you all, and some of you may be offended by this. Dogs can't play Jenga. They can't. And all those videos you saw of the dogs playing Jenga, they're fake. Every one of them. They have higher production values than a Cecil B. DeMille movie from the 1950s. It took hours to fake that picture. And you know it's true the moment I say it. But yet you probably shared that video with your grandmother anyway. And the question we all have to say is, what is our role as media consumers to be, each of us, a land break against the spread of information that is congenial to us, or pseudo-information, or claimed information that is congenial to us, but that we should know is not true.
Amen. So don't blame the algorithm. You create it for you, and it's really, really good at giving you what you want, probably better than what you expect it to be. That's why your Netflix is so popular. That show is good because you like the last one. Mm-hmm. But I am curious because of how much thought and time you put into your pieces, right? So we're equating what you do with a social media influencer, and I'm curious you have journalistic standards where you're literally legally liable for certain things. You have processes, you have editing rooms, other people don't. Yeah. And right now we're saying they're basically the same thing, and in fact the impact of the algorithm folks can have a reach far beyond what you do, yeah, despite the 100x work you put in.
Well, yes and no. In the 2016 campaign, and again in 2020, the Donald Trump people put a lot of effort into deceiving the New York Times with various stories, and in some cases, or misleading them. In some cases, like the story about Hillary Clinton being involved in a corrupt uranium deal, they were somewhat successful. So why did they bother? I mean, they had Breitbart, they had Fox News. Why not just put the story on Breitbart? Because they know even the people who read Breitbart don't exactly believe it. But if it's in the New York Times, it matters. And that was earned over a long period of time. When it's in the Atlantic, it's a different kind of news than when it's on the Daily Wire. And everybody knows that, most of all the people at the Daily Wire. And that's why they get so mad at me, because they want all the benefits of being trusted without doing the things that make you worthy of trust. So yeah, we spend a lot of time. And anyone who's been in journalism has made mistakes. And one of the questions that is a test of you journalists is, when you made a mistake in print, especially in the days when you couldn't correct it easily, how much and how long did you suffer afterwards? And I can think of mistakes I made in pieces that appeared in 1986. And I will still wake up at 3 in the morning. I'm not joking. I'm haunted.
Well, I have a list of all those mistakes I want to talk about.
My maker has them and will present me with that list someday when I'm called before the judge of the world. I know that. No, but the point is how seriously do you take that? The point to what makes the Atlantic or the New York Times different, it's not that we're never wrong. We're often wrong. Is how hard do we work not to be wrong, and how do we react when we are wrong? And how strenuously do we work to correct our mistakes when we make them, as we inevitably do?
What about politics right now? And this can be at any level or any person. What about politics right now are you more excited about, more hopeful about than you were even 4 or 8 years ago? Just lie alone.
Now, that's a question I did not anticipate, so I don't have an answer ready for that. But look, I think it has been. I wrote in a piece that appeared early in the Trump presidency that this was going to be a hard test, and what happened next was up to the people who were reading the work I was submitting to them. And I think by and large, the American people met that test. That Donald Trump was beaten again and again and again. He was beaten in 2018. By the way, the 2018 congressional election, at the time we read, it had the highest turnout of any congressional election since before the First World War. But of course, turnout is calculated as a percentage of those eligible. And before the First World War, women were not eligible. And before the First World War, in much of the South, black people were disenfranchised. And of course, 18 to 21-year-olds didn't have the vote. So if you computed turnout as a percentage not of those eligible, but of the entire adult population above the age of 18, the election of 2018 was the biggest democratic event in American history without a president at the top of the ballot. And people came out in enormous numbers to put a check on the lawlessness and criminality of the Trump presidency. And they did it again in 2020. And they did it again in the state of Georgia in 2021. And they did it again in 2022. They're more at the state level than at the federal level. People were not intimidated. And today on social media, which is increasingly a thug environment, which is intended to terrorize and deceive, again, people stand up and I don't want to exaggerate this. Americans don't face the kinds of dangers that people do in other countries. But precisely because you don't face the kind of dangers that people do in other countries, you have less excuse if you don't face whatever dangers there are, whatever risks there are, whatever fatigues there are. And people have stepped up, and I am confident they're going to do it again. One of my favorite movies, The Godfather, opens with that scene, I'm sure you've all seen it, where the opening words of The Godfather, "I believe in America." And the words are fraught with irony, because the person speaking them is an undertaker, and he's talking to a gangster, and he's plotting an act of extrajudicial violence to compensate for a bigoted failure of the American legal system. It's a very ironic phrase. But the reason the phrase works is because we all, at some level, do believe in America, and feel we should, and feel we can.
And again, and again, and again, it's a constant battle. So get your questions ready. I'm going to come to you in a second, but I'm curious, what's the one story that you didn't get down, that you wish you had more time to do, that there never was the right moment or hook to put it out there? What's the one that keeps you up at night because you still want your name attached to it?
Oh, well, those are all in I may get to it yet, so I'm not giving away the material.
Okay. How about your third best story? Or the one you wish you had a do-over on.
Oh, there is a one I had a do-over on, but I wish it's so painful that it's hard to talk about. But I got involved once in a quite disastrous book project, and I was compensated for it by being allowed to put my name on the title page. And boy, do I wish I hadn't. one of the, and that's another one that haunts my dreams at 3 in the morning, and that I'll have to answer for before the judge of the world.
Any questions in the audience out there for Mr. Frum? Yes, sir.
So, David, I came to Washington as a student turned working for a congressman at exactly the same time. I remember that, the decency and the quality of the debate between parties, and I also remember in that period of time the tremendous progress we've made as a society across the board in terms of racial discrimination, gay rights, being jailed for marijuana, tobacco, on and on and on. And the thing that frustrates me as somebody who's so committed to Trump being beaten is that we're still at a 49-49, and it's all, we're all hostage to the very center, the undecideds in a couple of swing states. And so why does that happen? Well, there are a couple of issues that the Democratic Party has just fumbled, inflation and immigration, and you can add one or two others.
Yeah.
So the flip side, what you were saying about what if Trump gets elected, if Harris gets elected, I mean, how do Democrats recapture that center in the way that Clinton did, in the way that Obama did, such that we can inoculate ourselves from this horrible MAGA pestilence that we're all facing?
Well, you raise a lot of issues, and they're so interesting. I'll tell you one story. So in this 1984, about times have changed. In the 1984 State of the Union, heading into the 1984 election, Ronald Reagan faced a big gender gap. And Nancy Reagan was very worried about it. She was his best political advisor. And so heading into in the 1984 State of the Union, she urged him, as a way to appeal to women voters, to commit to a White House task force on domestic violence. And so he said it. So shortly after that, the head of the Securities and Exchange Commission was arrested for throwing his wife down the stairs of their house. And the question was, what should happen from an official point of view to this man who'd been criminally charged for brutalizing his wife? Now, to that point, there had been a number of incidents in the Pentagon, in the military. Uniformed military personnel had been disciplined for domestic abuse, but there had never been a case of a civilian being disciplined. And there was an op-ed about this. This became a huge controversy, and there was an op-ed in the Washington Post that, at the time, that said he should be left alone because this was a tremendous invasion of people's privacy to punish somebody. And Reagan ended up firing him, the first person to lose his job for domestic abuse. It seems incredible now that that would be a question. If the head of the SEC throws his wife down the stairs, should he stay the head of the SEC? But in 1984, it was a question, and today it's not. Look, I am not invested in the Democratic Party in any way. I remain a registered Republican. And I think one of the good things that could happen to this country is that Trump gets beat, the Republicans lose the House, they come to their senses, they regroup, the Democrats do go too far to the left. And then they pay the price to a revivified, useful Republican Party. That's maybe how this whole train gets back on the proper railway track again. But it's also true that the question of what it means to be left and right, it's constantly changing. And we often use an obsolete vocabulary to describe the problems of today. And just as my story about what happened between 1920 and 1964 suggests what it meant to be on one side or another changed over time, so it is constantly changing. And the politics of 20 years from now will look very different, I think, from the politics of today.
What figure in your time in political life doesn't get the credit due? The one that you think is just a speaking of principles first, like who represents this type of governing institutional structure, the model lawmaker who just doesn't have their place in history?
I will tell you, I'll give you a name and I'll give you a claim. So, George H.W. Bush took over the presidency, of course, in January of 1989. The Berlin Wall came down so shortly after, and the Soviet Union collapsed 2 years after that. The problem that George H.W. Bush was consumed with, above all others during his presidency, was the Soviet Union left behind 50,000 nuclear weapons. And to the astonishment of Americans who were invited to inspect them, they had no security precautions whatsoever. Like in the 1980s, if you went to an American nuclear facility, there were all kinds of protocols and procedures and fences. But the Soviet Union watched its people, so it didn't have to watch its weapons. So the weapons were stored in shacks with chicken wire, literally chicken wire around them, and that was it, because you were not, it was illegal to come within 200 miles of those sites unless you had a special passport. And when the system collapsed, the security around the weapons, and George H.W. Bush, that became concern number one. And he and his national security advisor worked tirelessly on this question. It kept them up at night. It was their top priority. They created all kinds of programs to secure both the weapons and the raw materials and the scientists who knew how to make the weapons. And they succeeded so well that no one even remembers that this was once the biggest problem facing the human race. The problem has been forgotten because it was solved so well. I wrote an article about this for The Atlantic called "The Bombs That Didn't Go Off." And if somebody had told Americans in the summer of 1991 the Soviet Union was going to collapse and all those 50,000 unguarded nuclear weapons, not a one of them is going to go astray. And by the way, many of them are going to end up as fuel inside civilian reactors in the United States. There's a period in the 1990s where the largest user of Soviet nuclear weapons was American nuclear reactors, and they paid ridiculous prices to buy the new components and then to use them to make peaceful civilian power and not to have them go off. I think just generally the things that H.W. Bush did, peaceful unification of Germany, the peaceful end of the Cold War, the securing of the Soviet nuclear weapons, those are tremendous achievements. And this is the great injustice of politics. When you've really succeeded, no one even remembers what the question was.
We saw that in a post-Trump world where everyone was looking for boring, right? Following the 2016 to 2020, we wanted to forget about politics for a little bit. That was a sign of success.
Yes.
Other questions out here? Yes, sir.
Thank you. So you've made me very excited for my jury duty tomorrow. So hopefully that's a good omen.
Yeah.
My question is, you worked for George W. Bush. There's been a lot of chatter about, as you know, him endorsing. So I'm wondering what you think about a former president like George W. Bush at this moment, not endorsing in this race, whether you think he should endorse, or what the role of someone like that should be.
Well, I have a lot of sympathy for his decision thus far. Now, I mean, I hope he will change his mind. I don't know what it will accomplish, but I have a lot of sympathy for his decision so far, and let me explain why. You all remember the transition from Trump to Biden, the worst transition in American history. You probably don't remember the transition from Bush to Obama, which was the best transition in American history. There's actually a book written, I think, someone by a woman who may be a GW academic, Kumar is her last name. And it's a fantastic book about presidential transitions in general, with using the Bush-Obama. And remember, of course, the election is November of 2008. The world financial system goes into crisis in October of 2008. And the crisis hits bottom in January of 2009. And the outgoing administration, the incoming administration had to work together in ways that sent two messages. One is the incomers had to make clear there's one president at a time, and until midday on the 20th of January 2009, George W. Bush is the president, and what he says goes. But he also had to take into account, but every decision I make in these months of crisis, my successor is going to bear the consequences. And so one of the dramatic examples of this is one of the questions they faced was General Motors went into crisis. Should General Motors be allowed to go bankrupt or not? Or should it be saved? So one option was obviously let it go bankrupt, let the market decide, and then Obama would inherit the consequences of a bankrupt General Motors. Another decision was to save it, and then Obama would inherit that. And Bush in the end said, I'm giving them enough credit to keep them alive for 90 days. So that my successor will inherit the right to make that decision. And so the relationship, as a result of those, and many other instances like that of mutual trust, the relationship between Bush and Obama became intensely personally close. And one of the closest pairings of incoming and outgoing president, maybe ever. And the result of all of that was that when Obama was up for re-election in 2012, Bush did nothing. Bush did not campaign for Romney. He didn't do anything because basically Obama was his friend.
Oh.
And he didn't want it. So the question was, the Republicans said, why aren't you campaigning for Obama? They needed a little fundraising, but basically no. And so he said, because I am not taking part in politics anymore. I'm out of politics, I've retired, I'm just not doing it. So he created this rule. He wanted to govern a particular, many of us have done this in our lives. You want to govern a particular case, you create a general rule to explain why you're not doing a particular thing. And then you're stuck. Then Trump comes along. And George W. Bush was I actually think there'll be someday when the Oxford History of America gets around to doing the Trump years, the title will be, Volume 12 of the Oxford History of America. That was some weird shit.
End of book.
No, that'll be the title. Like what hath God wrought is the title of the chapter on the 1840s. The title of the chapter on the 2020s will be some weird shit. But so I understand why he is not doing it. But it is a strange thing that going to this race. I think every surviving relative of every living Republican president is voting for Harris. I mean, it's weird, right? Like there's not a one. I mean, it would be like, what if we lived in a world in which the Kennedys and the Trumans and the Obamas and the Clintons were all voting for the Republican nominee? I mean, some of them wouldn't be here, but their children, their surviving spouses. So I don't think there's any doubt what Bush's intentions are, and I think both Trump knows that, and probably most Republicans get it. But I think he feels constrained.
Speaking of endorsements, we saw an interesting phenomenon this week with the Washington Post refusing to endorse a candidate. Curious your thoughts on that, and then the Bezos statement today.
I think the story is really, truly, and dangerously misunderstood. And I think it's an example of how people are falling for indirection. The story, in my mind, is not that the Washington Post people were cowardly or that Bezos was cowardly. The story is that one of the richest men in the world is so frightened of retaliation by Donald Trump that he, despite having bought the paper and kept it alive and done extraordinary work, he's scared of Trump.
Yeah.
That's the story. That Rupert Murdoch understands that if he endorses Harris and Harris wins, nothing bad will happen to him.
Right.
Actually, he'll make more money. Bezos, correctly, because we all remember that Amazon lost a $10 billion cloud computing contract to Microsoft as Trump retaliation. Bezos here, I don't think he's a villain. I mean, he's not a hero, obviously. A hero might have defied it, but he's not a villain. He's not behaving, and he's not even a coward exactly, because he's a prudent manager of business facing this threat. And so I think what we're all seeing is we're looking at the balloon with the little indented marks in it and thinking, gee, that balloon is certainly yielding to the indents. And what we ought to be thinking is, who's putting the indents in the balloon in the first place?
What would happen if he said that publicly?
He has said it. Everyone understands this. They're saying it is our fear of state retaliation that is the cause of our non-statement. That could not be more clear, I think. And I don't know that he has said it personally. But anyway, I don't look at this. I don't blame the Post. I don't even exactly blame him. He could do better, but I think he has a lot of things to manage. I blame the people who are threatening the retaliation against a range of business enterprises if a newspaper does something they don't like.
Yes, Mag.
I have a follow-up question to that. Today, just this afternoon, the Atlantic endorsed Vice President Harris. What's your reaction to that?
The Atlantic has been around since before the Civil War. We've done 5 endorsements. One of Lincoln in 1860. We were neutral in 1864. One of Johnson in 64 over the Civil Rights Act, and then now 3 against Trump. And what I am really looking forward to, and one of the things that is keeping me, although I'm a very fatigued person who want to be out of journalism, what's keeping me there I am looking forward to our non-endorsement in 2028, where the Atlantic can say, it's back to politics as usual, and we are here to provide you stories about the arts, music, literature, and we're not here to tell you how to vote because we have gone back to normal, and it's your decision again, reader and Mrs. Reader.
A sign of strength that you're sitting it out.
Exactly.
Beautiful. Others? Go ahead, Jennifer, and then we'll go back over here.
You mentioned retaliation just now,
Yeah.
and you mentioned Mike Pence, Vice President Mike Pence, earning his place in history. In the grand scheme of things, I would agree with you. But the immediate effect for him was he faced a lot of backlash and even death threats for his decisions. And I'm sure Speaker Johnson is aware of the same realities that he's facing. So Do you think that we've just entered this new era where just violence is the new normal? Or do you think that we are able to come back from that? And if so, what would it take?
Violence is the old normal. American politics has always been very violent. Mercifully, American policing has gotten a lot better over the past decades. And so from Reagan to Trump, there have been many, many attempts against candidates. I talked about the Bush-Obama transition. One of the reasons it became so close was there was a very credible threat of a suicide bombing aimed at President-elect Obama in 2009. And the Bush people and the Obama people had to work very carefully to protect him and to make sure that he was able to deliver his inaugural address. That was part of where the basis of trust came, because you could easily imagine if the relationship were a little different, that the Obama people would think, well, the only reason you're hyping this threat is to wreck our inaugural address. And the Bush people would say, are you kidding? You're taking your life in your hands, and it's our responsibility. After 12:01, it's on you, but at 11:59, it's on us. But indeed, they built this basis of trust. They protected him successfully, and the threat was dismantled. It's just it's a big, violent country with a lot of firearms in it, and a lot of oddballs and loners. And it's a striking thing about American violence is how often it is not political in a way that is directly related to party politics. You go through the killing of Lincoln was very political, but a lot of Kennedy was not exactly mapped onto any kind of pre-existing political structure. And the man who shot Reagan was trying to impress a movie actress. And the man who did shoot at Trump and the man who may have shot at Trump were both MAGA supporters who in some way were alienated in ways that I don't pretend to understand. But there are risks, and I think one of the things I'm going to say this, it's going to sound a little harsher than I mean it, and there's a camera on, and I'm recognizing this is maybe an unsuitable thing to say in front of the camera. But it's a huge country. It's a powerful and wealthy country. The rewards at the top of the game of politics are enormous in a way that they are power and wealth and global influence. So if the risks are big too, you have to face those. And when you join this game, you have to understand that along with the enormous rewards, you face those deadly risks. And you can't go coward. You can't go coward just because of the risk. Your life is, of course, a precious thing and of tremendous value to those who love you and value to your country. But in the end, you have to care about things even more than you care about your life. Lincoln did, and others have done. So I'm glad Mike Pence came to safety, but if he hadn't, it would have been a noble ending.
I agree with you. I fear like we're missing the downstreams effects of this. So a lot of my students are in entry-level positions on Capitol Hill offices. They're the ones receiving the phone calls where literally threats are being made.
Yeah.
You're saying, hey, 19-year-old, this is going to be worth your threat on your life. Violence is now a consideration where before it wasn't for them. And then extending down to even poll workers where they're having trouble staffing offices to count literal ballots.
Yeah.
I get the abstraction that this is a noble cause worth dying for, but is that minimizing who we should actually be blaming and the steps we can take to actually correct it?
Oh, look, if you catch people doing this stuff, whoever set that...
What about the causes of it?
Whoever set the fire in that Washington State office to help Joe Kent, I think that's what it looks like they were doing. I hope that person goes to prison is caught and goes to prison for a long time. But there is just no blinking. This is a violent country with a lot of firearms, and there isn't a ready answer to that. And when you go into politics, I can't promise you safety. I really can't.
There has to be something in between not being able to promise you and saying and a one silver bullet answer. There has to be something marginal, incremental steps we can take. Look, that this is unacceptable, and here's what we can do about it.
Look, and the police do get better, and they have a lot of resources and tools, and if they need more, they should have more. And my views on guns, I published them. It should be a lot harder to get one, and there should be more. But that's not going to happen. And so the question is, in the face for those 19-year-olds. In the face of the things they can't change, all they're responsible are for their own actions. I understand that people are deterred if a lot is asked of them, but sometimes a lot is asked.
What about parents sending their kids to school?
That shouldn't be as hazardous as it is, but that again, that's a slightly different topic. Yeah, you should not be in the kind of danger that American school children are in, and that would be not an easy. At this point, there's so many weapons it would not be an easy or swift problem to fix, but it's fixable. But this country seems to have very little determination to do anything about that, and given that the availability of firearms and the availability of weapons of all kinds, this is just, one of the things after some atrocity, politicians are fond of saying, that's not who we are. I wish that were true.
Yeah.
It is who you are.
Yes, sir.
Thank you for being here first. And it's not inconceivable next week that VP Harris wins a majority of the popular vote and still loses the election, which would be a third time in a generation that the person who won a minority of the vote ends up winning 100% of the power. What does it say about our status as a representative democracy when the system working the way it's designed to work allows for those results so consistently?
Yeah, it says something bad. So, it's been theoretically possible for a long time for these things to happen. And at various points in the 20th century, in 1960, had 100,000 more Californians voted for Richard Nixon than did. Richard Nixon would have won the popular vote, but John F. Kennedy would certainly have won the electoral vote. Had a few thousand more people in Ohio voted for Gerald Ford, he would have won the electoral vote and lost the popular vote to Jimmy Carter. But those were near misses. But all of those cases, had they happened, had it been Nixon and had it been Ford, as with W. Bush in 2000, Americans could say, look, in a country of hundreds of millions of voters, that is a functional tie, and the Electoral College serves as a tiebreaker. So although it's not as pretty as if the functional tie had gone the other way, really, if 100 million votes are cast and you win by 100,000, okay, so you can live with it. And all of those presidents also, had it been Nixon, had it been Ford, when it was Bush, were very conscious of not overstepping their mandate. And of trying to work with others. And also in all of those cases, the Congress was very closely divided. And so the president was checked. It mercifully happened with Kennedy and Ford. He was not a minority president, but the man who might have been a minority president, in the case of W. Bush, the man who was a minority president, were all checked by Congress. What was different in the 2010s is people were losing elections that are not close. If Clinton had beaten Trump, that would not have been, she beat him by 3 million votes, 2 points. Not a close election. 2020, 7 million votes, not a close election. I think in the popular vote, I'm skeptical that this election will be close in the popular vote. So when we get through the other side of this, I think we are going to have to reckon with the Electoral College is no longer funny. It's dangerous. And it's going to be hard to, it was nearly fixed in 1968 after that close election in which George Wallace nearly tipped the election into the House of Representatives, and there's a bill then. There are ways to do it. I don't have I have my preferred mechanisms, but I don't stress them. There are a lot of good solutions, but it's becoming dangerous. And once we get to the other side of the immediate danger, I think it's past you. And when people defend the Electoral College, they all defend the part of the Electoral College the founders did not intend. The founders didn't intend for there to be huge population differences between the states. They intended for there not to be popular voting. That was the point of the Electoral College, was you would get the wise and good of the country, the property, clergy people together, and they would pick the president. And that scheme fell apart almost instantly. And all that remains are the messy mistakes with the original purpose of the Electoral College, long dead and unlamented by anybody. No one who defends the Electoral College ever says, I don't think we should have popular election of the president. They all say, I believe in popular election of the president, I just think that North Dakota should have disproportionate say. And how does that make any sense?
Founders did not see California coming, that's true. What happens if and when Trump declares victory at 12:01 on Wednesday morning? How should we as a society respond? What is the media's role in that?
Yeah.
And what's the pushback like?
I think one of Trump's vulnerabilities is he always uses the same trick over and over again in a country with a desperate craving for novelty. He needs a new trick, and he will have the old trick, and I think it will not work.
So he will do it,
He will
and
do
we
it.
will respond differently.
I think people will just not, people will be in bed.
I hope so, man. I don't know.
I think he'll do it, and my guess is he does it, and absolutely nothing happens. People just don't pay attention. It's just more blather from the crackpot, it will not mobilize people the way it did when it was so shocking and new to do such a thing in 2020. This time it's going to be an old story, and everyone's saying, well, we know it's not true.
Well, what if only 10%? He's not gonna. Not all of everyone will ignore him. 10% will. That is what, 10 million people. That's plenty.
In 2021, when people from around the country came to Congress to try to sack the building and kidnap or murder the Speaker of the House and the Vice President, they weren't all hardened insurrectionists. Many of them were coming because they thought they were obeying the president and thought that the president was sort of in command. And when the president said something, that made it legal. Trump is not the president. He will not be the president. If you take part in illegal activities, you're very clearly going to be breaking the law against constituted authority on behalf of an out-party candidate. That is not to say there was no one who will do it, but it's much more daunting. One other thing that everyone is going to keep in mind is, I made clear my lack of regard for the Supreme Court's decision. What the Supreme Court and the courts collectively have done is said, look, we're very hesitant about punishing Donald Trump for what he did in 2021. But the rest of you, you're going to prison. There is no mercy for all the foot soldiers. And I think the foot soldiers have figured out, okay, I'm glad they may think that Donald Trump's not going to prison, but I am a little worried that I may go to prison, and not for a short time, but in some cases for 9 years. So the system has reasserted itself with some effect, and I'm hoping I'm just hoping to God.
There we go.
I'm
Me
hoping
too.
to God that what I'm saying is true, or proves true. But I think that the traditions of this country since the 1960s has been that when violence happens, it happens in kind of from disturbed loners acting for parapolitical reasons, and not from organized mobs acting for political reasons.
Then have you been disenchanted by a lot of the Republican Party's response to that, explaining away that type of behavior? Because they don't say it in that strict of terms, and people are looking to them. They are officers.
Yeah, no, they should. They should. It's really bad. And let's hope that the system is strong enough that their badness can be published with oblivion rather than memory.
One more. Yes, sir.
So this is a follow-up on what that gentleman said about the polls and being dead heat. Very nice magazine called The Atlantic had a wonderful story by a fellow named Brian Klaus called The Truth About Polling.
Yeah.
Did you read it?
I didn't, but I know the argument that polling is degenerating fast.
Yeah, and he cites demographic changes, technological changes,
Yeah.
and I wasn't sure whether I should be relieved or depressed after I read it, because it suggested that basically the polls are bullshit.
Yeah, the polls are just look. It's like everything in modern life. So when I made a phone call in 1987, I never said, "Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Can you hear me?" They heard me. Sound quality was fantastic, but I couldn't do that call anywhere other than a few fixed points in a private residence or office. So now you can call somebody in New Zealand from the beach here and speak for free with video but the quality of the sound call isn't as good as it's going to be 25 years from now. So it's a trade-off. So we have a lot of information, but the polls have deteriorated for technological and cultural reasons. I think that's just something to keep in mind. The quality of the polling is less good than it was in 1985 or 1995.
So are you guardedly optimistic?
I believe in America, like The Undertaker.
Yeah, like the mob.
It wasn't the mobsters then. It was the mobsters.
Undertaker.
It was the would-be mobster.
That's cold comfort.
All right, and so for a final note, I tell every single one of my classes at the beginning and at the end of the semester that the hardest part of my job is to teach you to be successful in a political world that I wish were different, right? That these kids are coming into a world, they want a job now, they have the best and brightest motivations, but I want them to be prepared for offices and situations in politics of which they're walking into. So what is your message to, recognize we have different generations in the room, but the world is soon to be inhabited and led by the young. What do you give them now that isn't just hope and wait and we will bend towards justice? What message do you want to leave them with?
So one of my favorite novels is by Joseph Conrad. It's called Lord Jim. It's about a man who, in the early part of his career, is disgraced by an impulsive act of cowardice. And he spends the whole rest of his life trying to get that moment back. And explaining to everyone who will listen, and many who will not listen, that if he'd had more time to think, he would have done a braver thing. And no one believes him. And the whole novel builds to a moment where there's another moment of courage called for him. And this time he does have time to think. And it's true. He was just someone who couldn't be brave impulsively, but could be brave deliberately. And that was just a human quirk of his personality. And what I say to them is, I'm not going to judge you for being careerists. I'm not going to judge you for wanting a nice life. But there's going to be a moment, and maybe 40 years from now, when God and country need you. Be ready for that.
Amen. Principles first, thank you very much. David Frum, thank you for taking the time tonight, especially everything going on. PW, thank you all for coming out. Thank you very much.